Okay, so in the current climate, data centers, they are pretty much under significant scrutiny, I guess, as you've seen as being power hungry. Various authorities are even maybe restricting the amount of data center, development goes on. So, and that's even before we get to AI and the AI explosion. Nobody quite knows, but it's going to be huge, etc. So, yeah, just how bad, if you like, is the picture for the data center industry at the current time?
Yeah, that's a good question to start with. Data centers are huge consumers of energy. I think it was the IEA who estimated in 2022 that the data center industry was responsible for 1.3% of the global electricity consumption. So yeah, definitely a big impact. I guess the question we need to ask ourselves is, what would the world look like if our business, so-called DCS, or the data center industry as a whole did not exist? So it means, both looking at from a perspective of how the data center industry is enabling the digital transformation, but also what should we be doing as an industry to create a positive impact on society and environment. And I guess it's really good to see that more and more businesses in our industry, but also in the wider tech industry, are trying to answer this question. I guess the next step for us is to address the consequences that come from answering this question. Of course, a big part of that is also, of course, looking at our energy consumption, both from a power supply. So how can we decarbonize the power supply by introducing more renewable energy projects to the market? But more importantly, for the data center industry, is looking at the demand side. So how can we reduce our energy consumption and also transition to renewable energy across our operations? So we have set ourselves a target to become 100% renewable by 2030 across our global operations. At the moment, we are 100% renewable in Europe, UK, India, and partly Japan. But we're looking to also expand this further in Asia. And for our new data centers, for instance, we're also looking into including on-site generation of renewable energy into our designs. So this is, for instance, through solar panels.
Okay, yeah, and so in terms of what the industry can do as a whole to improve its environmental performance and obviously the image that goes with that, I think one of the important things yourself, Colt, suggest is a commitment to science-based targets. So that sounds quite a important sort of phrase. What does it actually mean in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we look at how to improve environmental performance, I would say for any business, there are three really important steps that we need to focus on. So first of all, measuring your environmental performance. So historically, the data center industry, of course, have predominantly looked at PUE, so power usage effectiveness. But now you see that a lot of our peers and us ourselves too are looking more at a wider range of environmental KPIs. So this includes also greenhouse gas emissions, fuel and water consumption, waste consumption, biodiversity impacts also. And it's especially important that we measure these KPIs in the same way so that we can compare our performance across the industry, but also to understand what the collective impact is of our wider industry. So for instance, for climate change, we are using the greenhouse gas protocol to measure our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And this is a standard that is being used by many businesses and governments globally. Then the second step is that you need to define a strategy and set targets. So once you have a good understanding of your baseline performance, you need to identify the priority areas that are most important for your business. And then within those areas, set interim and long-term targets. So last year, we published our ESG strategy, which is environmental, social, and governance. And there are three key focus areas for us in that strategy. So first of all, decarbonizing our business, which is our environmental pillar, very much focused on how we need to reduce our emissions and reach net zero by 2045. Connecting people, which is our social pillar, focused on how we create a positive impact for our key stakeholder groups. So those are our employees, customers, suppliers, but also local communities. And lastly, safeguarding our company, which is our corporate governance pillar, and very foundational to everything we do around sustainability. And under each of these pillars, we've set specific targets, measurable goals, for us to keep track of our performance over time. So for instance, under decarbonizing our business, we have set science-based targets that are in line with the latest net zero standard of the SBTI, so the Science-Based Target Initiative. Basically, this means that the SBTI has verified that our targets and the roadmap that sit behind our targets are in line with the science that sit behind the Paris Agreement. So this is important because, like I mentioned before, we need to measure it in the same way as everyone else. Once the greenhouse gas emissions are in the atmosphere, it's everyone's responsibility to reduce it. So that's why we chose for the SBTI standard. And behind the targets, we identified 6 programs to reduce our emissions in our direct operations, but also our wider value chain. So our SBTI targets consist of short-term and long-term targets. So on the short term, we're looking to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 47% by 2030 compared to a 2019 baseline. For scope 3, we're looking to reduce our emissions by 28% by 2030. And then we have a long-term net zero target to become net zero by 2045. And then the last and most important step is implementation, and I guess also the most difficult step for most companies. So you need to identify the actions that are most relevant to your business, to your operations, and eventually also work with your supply chain partners to improve their performance in line with our decarbonization pathway. So in our direct operation, this, for instance, includes transitioning to alternative fuels such as HVO, but also procuring renewable energy, of course, and transitioning to low global warming potential refrigerants or alternative cooling systems in our new data centers. And in our wider chain, it means close collaboration with our supply chain partners to make sure that they are also decarbonizing their emissions in the same way we are.
Okay, on the renewables front, I think you said earlier that in much of the company you're already at 100% use, but it's still. But I'm just wondering, I'm always intrigued as to how sort of transparent, how traceable, the people supplying you say, yes, it's renewable energy, but obviously it doesn't come in, coloured green, if you like. So how easy is it to ensure that you're getting truly renewable energy? And also just interested, I think you mentioned about the on-site generation microgrids and stuff, just the potential those have for yourself and the industry at large as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we procure renewable energy through mostly renewable energy certificates, so REGOs, and for our scope 2 emissions, we calculate the impact on both ways, so both a market-based methodology and a grid average methodology, so location-based. And yeah, it's not always easy to get a assurance that it's always 100% renewable, but the procurement or the renewable energy certificates that we procure come from 100% renewable energy sources. But of course, that doesn't mean that the grid average is always green. It also depends on the location where you are. If you're, for instance, looking at France, it's much more nuclear based versus India or Japan, where they're a bit more behind on renewable energy as an average in the grid. But yeah, it's nonetheless very important that we do continue to look at that, including also long-term contracts like PPAs. And for our new sites, we are including renewable energy also on site wherever this is possible. Of course, there's always a limitation in terms of space that you need for on-site generation. But we have, for instance, already solar panels in the Netherlands that cover part of the electricity consumption for our data center there.
Okay, and in terms of, I think you also mentioned about cooling innovation, and most people, I guess, would assume cooling innovation automatically means liquid cooling. So I don't know if that's right or not, but just again, if you can perhaps outline what it is you're doing or looking at doing with the cooling part of the data center.
Yeah, well, I have to admit, I'm not a cooling expert, but happy to connect you to one of our colleagues in the engineering team who is. But for instance, for new data centers, we are trying to prepare for instance, what is going to come with the AI transition. And that means that, we need to have more efficient cooling systems that are also environmental friendly. That's often a difficult combination, but liquid cooling is the most obvious choice there. From a sustainability perspective, liquid cooling can be more sustainable, as in it's more efficient because it's closer to the surface, so more efficient than, for instance, air cooling. Yeah, for our legacy data centers, it's much more difficult to transition to alternative cooling systems. There we look much more at how can we make sure that we use the most low global warming potential refrigerants as possible to reduce our environmental impact there.
And in terms of the waste heat that's generated through cooling, have you got any programs or plans to I know sort of district heating, it often depends where the data, if the data center is in the middle of nowhere, then it's very difficult to repurpose the heat. But if it's in the middle or close to, whether it's an industrial estate or, in a city, there's opportunities. So just your thoughts, I guess, as to the waste energy capture, reuse potential.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the moment, we don't have any projects for our legacy sites, but we are looking to include these in our new data centers. So for instance, we are building a new data center in Hayes in West London. This is going to be a 57 megawatt facility. We started construction in February 2023. And basically, we are including principles in the design of our new data centers to enable waste heat recovery. But yeah, like you mentioned, the opportunity, like how to reuse that in the local community needs to be there. So we're still exploring those options.
And you mentioned again about the legacy, with cooling, maybe not so easy to upgrade. And I'm just intrigued what we've talked about so far, because you've obviously got legacy data centers, then you've got brownfield where an existing building, whether it's a factory or whatever it is repurposed as a data center. And then if you're lucky enough, shall we say, you have a brand new greenfield, so you can build it to the best environmental standards from day one. Just your thoughts, I guess, as to how easy it is, because if in terms of the overall carbon footprint, people suggest, I'm sure rightly, that brownfield, for example, where the building's already there, clearly you don't have to consume a lot or create a lot of carbon by construction. So just your thoughts, I suppose, as to the challenges and opportunities for each of those types of data center.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the benefit of building a new data center is, of course, that you can integrate sustainability from the start. As you mentioned, it's sort of already when you're selecting the location. Yeah, especially assessing the impact of construction and the building phase around the environment is very important in that sense. Most of our data centers, new data centers, are being built on brownfield sites. And in the past, local authorities have predominantly looked at, what is the impact on energy, what is your energy consumption look like, what is the impact on air pollution. But in the past few years, you also see that local governments are also focusing more and more on what the impact is on biodiversity and nature. And there you see that it's much more beneficial to build on a brownfield site rather than on a green basis. So in the UK, for instance, developers must now deliver a biodiversity net gain of at least 10% for new developments, which is a new regulation that came into action in November 2023, I think. So this basically means that developers need to conduct an ecological assessment before construction and after construction, and include urban greening design principles into the design of their data centers. So we're doing that, for instance, at our Hayes site in West London. So that is also being built on a brownfield site. And by including biodiversity principles such as green walls, green roofs, or tree planting around the data center site, we are able to create a biodiversity net gain of over 700%. And we're also trying to do this in and around our legacy sites. But of course, there's much more flexibility when you do this for a new data center site. Yeah.
And in terms of the overall supply chain, I'm wondering, I presume it's quite important to try and find like-minded, partners to work with who share your values. But I'm wondering, is that always easy to find? I mean, is everyone sort of heading in the same direction at the same pace, or do you sometimes bump into a supplier and you think, well, actually, they're not necessarily, they don't really understand where we're trying to go? Just, I suppose, your thoughts as to how easy or not it is to find like-minded partners to work towards the net zero?
Yeah, good question. We have quite an extensive supplier engagement program in place as part of our net zero roadmap. I guess understanding your environmental impact across your value chain is one of the most challenging things that businesses have to address when it comes to sustainability. I think for most companies, over 80% of their carbon footprint sits within scope 3 of their emissions. For Colt DCS specifically, around 70% of our scope 3 emissions come from our suppliers. So it's definitely important that we are selecting the right suppliers and working with the right suppliers to reduce those emissions. So we set ourselves a target to engage with 93% of our suppliers by emissions in order for them to set at least the scope 1 and 2 science-based targets themselves by 2025. And basically, we're trying to engage and select the right suppliers from the start of the engagement. So, for instance, during the tender process, we have identified a set of criteria, sustainability criteria, to benchmark our suppliers and make sure that they are aligning with our science-based targets. And then we try to collect as much as possible supplier-specific data points. So we do that by sending out a sustainability questionnaire every year, but also asking our suppliers to respond to CDP Climate and EcoVadis. And this enables us not only to improve the data quality of our scope 3 emissions, but also act on actual supplier-specific emissions data. I guess for us, it's especially challenging because our supply base changes quite quickly, depending on where and when we are building. So especially when you look at our construction partners, this really depends on where we're building that year a new data center and where we have most of our spends. Because of that reason, it's even more important that we do this every year. For us, I guess the next step is to look at improving the supply data even more to get more accurate data from our suppliers by, for instance, also asking for LCAs or life cycle assessment data or embodied carbon data from the construction phase, but also from our OPEX suppliers.
And how important do you think it is for the industry at large? You referenced PUE, which has been the standard sort of measurement for many years, but I think everyone understands that it's capable of being, shall we say, manipulated. PUEs can be manipulated. So how important, you mentioned science-based targets earlier on. Do you think that's crucial that the industry potentially comes up with a sort of manipulatable, if that's even a word, set of regulations or rules so that all of the companies can be compared? Because at the moment, I'm sure all the data center companies say we're doing a fantastic job being sustainable, but it's not necessarily easy to measure that, and they're not always as transparent. So if amidst the sort of my confused question, I guess what I'm trying to say is how can we compare data center to data center? What do you suggest?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that is already coming up in the EU and the UK specifically. So we see one of the key trends in sustainability around the data center industry is that the regulations around sustainability are increasing. So there are 3 key regulations that are coming our way. First is the EU CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And basically this regulation is requiring businesses, including the data center operators, to report more transparently on non-financial KPIs across environmental, social, and governance. Second one is EU taxonomy, which is a classification system for financial institutions to determine how environmental sustainable a data center exactly is. So PUE is one of the criteria, but there are loads of other criteria, including the EU Code of Conduct on energy efficiency for data centers. And lastly, the EED, so the Energy Efficiency Directive, which requires data center operators to report on energy consumption, PUE, renewable energy use, heat reuse. So these regulations are becoming much more strict, but at the same time, it also create an opportunity to increase transparency and comparison across the players in the data center industry. What all of these three regulations have in common is that they are not only asking for KPIs that can be measured in a data center's direct operation, but also in the wider value chain. So for instance, the EED requires data center operators to also report on IT equipment and data traffic, which is of course more in the responsibility of our customers. And the CSRD is requiring businesses to report on the impacts in our tier 2 and tier 3 supply chain. So these are all regulations that require us to collaborate even more with our suppliers and also the customer side. And luckily, well, it's good that these regulations are also impacting our suppliers and customers in that sense, so that we can share this information more transparently across the entire value chain.
And do you think most those data center organizations have a way to go when it comes to the necessary, ironically, they're created often to store vast amounts of data for their customers, but data itself, the data center companies need to obtain perhaps more data about their operations, as you say, the value chain. So do you think there's a way to go in general for the industry so that they do understand A, where they are, and then B, where they need to go and how they can get there? Is that fair, or do you think most of them are already getting all the information? It's just a question they need to act on it?
Well, I guess data management and the whole process is quite a challenge for most companies. So I would say a lot of these new regulations highlight areas that some companies have not even thought of, not even collected data on. But it is something that, every company needs to work on in the upcoming years. I mean, last week we launched our new telemetry platform, which basically allows our hyperscale customers to monitor our operations in real time. So this includes, for instance, KPIs on power usage, internal and external temperatures, electricity usage for our cooling systems. And by having all this data in one platform, it enables our customers to act on those insights and, for instance, shift processing loads to improve efficiency, but also to reduce any cost. But the ideal situation is, of course, that we implement this platform across our global operations in every data center site. This is something that is included in our new data center sites, but much more difficult to also implement in legacy sites, and also expand it to more of the sustainability KPIs that I mentioned before, so including water consumption, our fuel consumption, refrigerant leakages. So that's, I guess, a challenge for any company to identify those areas where those improvements are needed, and put investments to, for instance, implement sensors and add that to a central place where you can monitor it.
Maybe just to then, in summarizing and finishing, do you get the vibes from knowing the industry as you do that it's headed in the right direction at the right pace to meet? I mean, I think the data center industry has signed up to sort of 2030-ish type targets, but clearly then there's the 2050, which the sort of whole world is more focused on. Do you think the industry, and bearing in mind the AI explosion, which is actually going to add a whole load more sort of infrastructure, many more data centers, more power consumption, do you think it's on the right path, or do you occasionally sit there and worry and think, actually, we're perhaps, a lot of companies are saying a lot of good things, but if you look under the covers, there's perhaps not as much action going on as needs to be to get to these targets? Just your thoughts on that.
Well, I think the industry as a whole is making great progress. We've made great progress. If you look, for instance, at the improvements that we made in PUE, or the number of PPAs that has been purchased over a year. I think it was in 2023 that there was a record number of new PPAs that was being purchased in Europe, which was 40% higher than in 2022. So looking at those elements, we're making great progress, and it's good to see that more companies are setting science-based targets and also explaining what they are doing behind those targets. But there's always more to do. I think the IPCC report that was published last year in March around the same time basically mentioned that we're still not on track to to stay below the 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory with the policy measures that we have currently in place. So it means that, yeah, both governments and businesses need to step up even more and do some extra work in order to reach those targets. But yeah, overall, I'm staying optimistic, and I think we can definitely do it.
Okay, it's been fantastic to chat and some brilliant insights into the industry as a whole and Colt specifically. So, Anthea, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.